When I used to teach high school history, I'd start the first day of class by holding up the textbook and explaining to my students how very useful that huge, clunky textbook could be. For instance, it does a bang-up job of keeping papers from flying away on windy days. It also works reasonably well to keep the door open. My point here is not that textbooks are completely worthless. My point is that the job of a textbook is not to teach history. You see, that was my job. The job of the textbook, beyond paperweight and doorstop, is to be a reference. So it might be a good idea to use a textbook as a guide to teach your kids history. But whether you do or not, you'll want to find ways of making history come alive for your kids. If you're homeschooling and you want to introduce your kids to the real stuff of history, I've got 7 suggestions for you of how to go beyond the textbook and make history come alive. Number 1, ask your kids all sorts of questions about what they're reading. For instance, textbooks can make past events look inevitable, but no event is ever inevitable. Ask your kids what sort of decisions went into the historical events. What other choices could people have made, and what effects would those choices have had on the unfolding of history? Cultivating these sorts of historical discussions is crucial to teaching your kids what history really is. Suggestion number 2, make a timeline. Even putting up a line on a wall somewhere with markers every 500 years or so will do the trick. Allow your kids to label or color pictures of people, places, events, and slap them up on the wall. This is a terrific way to give your kids a real sense of the story of history, and it also allows visual kinesthetic learners somewhere to hang all of those details on. It's also interesting, the more things that go up on the timeline, to see how events have affected the unfolding of history and what sorts of things happened in other parts of the world at the same time. Suggestion number 3, use biographies. Whether it's books or videos, read aloud together or assigned individually to your child, biographies are a tremendous way to reinforce the fact that history is about actual, real live people, even if they're no longer alive. There are all sorts of biographies written for kids, but don't underestimate your kids' interest for biographies that are written for adults either, with the obvious caveat that adult-level biographies might also include adult-level topics. Suggestion number 4, use historical fiction. I cannot suggest this highly enough. Historical fiction hits the sweet spot of historical fact and narrative interest. If you're lucky, you'll find a series that your kids like, and you won't be able to stop them from delving into the past lives of famous people. One series that my kids really liked was The Royal Diaries. My girls are in college now, but they'll tell you when they hear the names of figures from those books, they don't just recall the figures' historical resumes, when they lived, why they were famous, etc. Instead, they recall the person that they got to know while reading the book. And all of that resume stuff comes along with it as icing on the cake. Suggestion number 5, watch history-based movies. Now, much the same as historical fiction is to writing, a good movie set in a historical time period, either with historical figures or fictional figures, is a great way of putting kids into a different reality. And frankly, I wouldn't worry too much about the historical inaccuracies, especially if you're able to point those things out to your kids. Often those discussions lead to great insights about the actual history of a time period or of a person. Suggestion number 6, use a history journal. One of the best things I ever did with my kids happened more or less on a whim one year. I took my kids to the store and let them pick out a blank journal. Then I took them to the library and told them each to pick out a few books on one historical time period, event, or person of their choice. For the next 2 weeks, every day, I told them to read through their books, identify things that they thought were interesting or important, and record those things in their journal, plus any images, maps, or pictures that they wanted to. Now, I thought it would be a good project, but I was blown away with how it turned out. I let them choose what they wanted, write down whatever they wanted. I didn't critique their choices. I didn't worry about spelling. I just let them go for it. Every 2 weeks, we'd go back to the library and they'd choose a new topic. The interest that they developed in history that year has stayed with them forever. And it also gave them a very informal taste into research. And that actually takes us right up to tip number 7. Tip number 7, prepare for formal research. If preparing your kids for formal history research sounds boring to you, it's probably because you have a misunderstanding of what historical research is. Historical research is about making historically based arguments. And let's face it, we all like making arguments. Now, students are going to be required to write formal research papers in high school and in college, so why not start laying the framework for those things when they're younger? Using my own experience as a student of history and a teacher of history, I worked backwards from the skills that students will need to use when writing formal research papers, and I created a workbook that develops those skills for younger students. It's called My Investigation Journal History Projects. It's a workbook that students can use to complete 12 history projects of their choice, all while learning important research skills. The pages in the workbook guide students through a 4-step process of finding a topic, conducting broad research, conducting narrow research, and completing a research project. The research that they do can be from a textbook, biography, movie, historical fiction, library book, or a combination of any of those things we previously talked about. In using this workbook with my own kids, I found that it's a great way to cultivate interest in history, to remind them that history is about real life people making real life choices, and it's a great tool to bridge the gap between informal history research and more formal research assignments. It also encourages kids to begin forming historically based arguments, which, as I mentioned before, are at the heart of all good history papers. If you're interested in checking out this history workbook, you'll find links in the description below. And hey, while you're down there, hit the subscribe button, leave me a comment, and ask any question that you might have. I hope you have a great school year, and I'll see you in the next one.